Sahana vavatu, sahanau punaktu, sahaviryam karavavahai, tejasvinavatitam astuma viddishavahai. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Hari Om Tat Sat. May that one protect us both. May that one nourish us both. May we have an invigorating study together. May we have enlightenment and strength. May we not unnecessarily argue or cavil with each other, and peace, peace, peace be unto all. So we are continuing our study of the 18th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, which, just to remind you, is a summary of all 18 chapters, or 17 chapters, condensed in a summary, the 18th chapter. And we were previously discussing those stanzas that were connected with Karma Yoga. We mentioned that Karma Yoga is Karma Sannyasa. Renunciation of action is actually called Karma Yoga. And just to remove any confusion, just to remind you, Karma Sannyas does not mean relinquishing activities. Karma Sannyasa means relinquishing your attachment to all these activities, renouncing your right to own or to think that we are in any way active for doing something. And that is the truth. So with last week, and Sister Nivedita's birthday celebrations due the next day, which were hugely successful, we mixed subjects. We discussed how Sister Nivedita was a karma yogi supreme, but she was not just a karma yogi. She integrated in her life aspects of meditation, aspects of devotion, aspects of love. Her whole life was an expression of love. And during the course of the week, a devotee had asked me a question. You know, this karma yoga seems much, much more difficult than jnana yoga. Jnana yoga requires a certain level of dedication, requires astute intellect, keen observation. But for the normal, everyday person, karma yoga is the way. But how can I practice it? How can I remember to be detached from every activity? It's very, very difficult. But here in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna tells us about, and he doesn't use these words, but we can use these words, karma bhakti. Karma Bhakti Yoga, that is, dedicating all activities, dedicating ownership and agency to the Lord of the universe. And Sri Krishna puts this in beautiful, beautiful language in these stanzas. But he begins by telling us how we can reach this goal of perfection. Everybody wants to strive towards perfection. And if we look at the universe carefully, we'll see there is a drive, a teleology toward the whole universe. There's a direction. There are some people who try to argue that there's no direction, and at the same time try to argue that there is evolution. But evolution, whether it's cosmic evolution or biological evolution, must have some kind of direction, because we can observe a series of changes. And these changes are increasing developments toward perfection. And we have this culmination called man. And we know that this man can evolve even further and can express or unfold into this perfection that is already there. Nothing new to acquire or obtain. Already there. Just to uncover, to unfold. And I mentioned, maybe last week or other sessions we had, that it is like folding a piece of paper. There's no new piece of paper. You can fold it, you can unfold it. When you unfold it, it's the same piece of paper. but it looks different. It is expanded. You can still see the creases and the evidence of its unfolding, but yet it is something different. The size is different, shape is different, and its capacity to be used is also different. So this is a good example of this movement toward perfection. And in the 50th stanza of the 18th chapter, this is what we are told, that we can learn in brief, because we take a whole lifetime to understand this and more. But we want something in brief. We want a synopsis of it. We want to get to the heart of it, the essence of something. And the Bhagavad Gita gets straight down to it. So what about karma bhakti? What about dedicating all your activities to God? We can do this in several ways, knowing that our attention may not necessarily all the time be captivated on spiritual being or our own inner essence or the Lord of the universe. And so recognizing this fact, we can introduce a discipline that at the beginning of an activity, we can dedicate this action to God. Or at the end of the activity, we can do that. Having done this, Lord, here it is. Thanks for giving me the capacity to do this, the energy to do this, the skills and talents to do this, the uniqueness to do this. And another question arose immediately before this talk. And it was asked what activities would be the most important, since we have domestic activities, probably work activities in the conventional sense of the word, a career to attend to. We have also our domestic life that involves business, finance, paying mortgages, all of these kinds of mundane things are there. And there is spiritual life. We think of spiritual life as something completely separate. And Arjun also makes this mistake, just to remind you. He also thinks it's much better to withdraw from this process of killing. And in reading this Bhagavad Gita and this Mahabharata, about the Mahabharata war and the great detail of it, we can often be remote from it. But today, in our own living memory, we have examples of people waging war in the most horrendous circumstances. It struck me the other day that there are more child soldiers. Child soldiers means anywhere between 9 and 16, say. More child soldiers in this world than had ever been. I don't know the exact number, but certainly millions. And we don't register these. We don't see these in newspapers. Imagine now a child that is accustomed to hold an AK-47 rifle and to hit and murder and cut off limbs and all the rest of it. A child brought up like that, whose mind is scarred with this. What a tragedy. So we can't avoid these tragic things. Life is full of them. But is there a different way of dealing with it? Yes, diving straight into it. That is why we so much admire Swami Vivekananda, his character, his emphasis on strength, his going into the problem and telling us about manliness, not as a gender thing, but as a quality of courage, quality of strength, quality of determination. And this is exactly what Krishna is exhorting Arjuna to do, to find all those inner qualities and express them like a great, great Beethoven symphony, full of loudness, full of vigor, full of strength, full of direction. Arise, awake, stop not until your goal is reached. This was Swami Vivekananda's version of a translated version of that Kathopanishad stanza, So, Utishtata Jagrata Prapyavaram Nibodhata. So it goes on like that. See, arise, awake, he translates that. Don't stop until the goal is reached. Near that passage, you'll also find that it is a precipitous journey, full of dangers, like treading on the edge of a razor. So, but still, with determination, we can go. We can't afford a sauntering attitude. We don't have unlimited time in this, in a sense. You have the opportunity here and now to do something. And you may not reach the end of your goal. It may take lifetime after lifetime after lifetime. But we should hold the ideal, just as when we climb a mountain, we should hold the ideal of the top of the mountain, reaching the top. And we should strive diligently toward that with a loving attitude. A loving attitude means the very easiest, most convenient attitude. All of us have emotions. It was the great Oscar Wilde that said that we run really on emotions over and above thinking. Emotions run us, essentially. So we should take advantage of that. All our resources should take advantage of. So all your life is spiritual. There is no separation, domestic or occupational or whatever it is. Don't think that spiritual life is sitting, meditating, doing japa, singing hymns and all of that. No, this is only a small segment of it. We have the capacity to sing, we may as well sing to God. We have the capacity to feel, we may as well direct all our energies Godwards. But we have the capacity to work, we may as well work for God. We have the capacity to think, we may as well occupy our minds with the question of reality, permanence, truth, God. So we have all these faculties, physical and mental. It's only that they are directed in a misguided way. What we call lust is nothing more than desire, and that desire can be directed Godward. Somebody asked Ramakrishna, I think it was Swami Purnananda, asked him, what will I do with lust? And he was surprised to find that Ramakrishna, the master, said, you have to increase your lust. Increase it. Increase it for God. That's all energy. Take that energy, direct it in a different way. So we have a method not of making combat with negative. We have a method of sublimating things and transmuting them into something beautiful, something rewarding, something that is joyful and blissful, where grief goes away. We all want to combat grief. No, don't combat it. There's a great example, you see, of how do we combat our shadow. So if you decide you don't want your shadow, it's a nuisance, it follows you everywhere, then you might decide one day you'll sit in ambush and attack it. Or you'll chase it away. You'll make sure that it gets insulted or shoot it with an arrow. None of these methods, as you know, will work. Leave it be. And then face toward the sun and walk toward it. This idea is found in all the approaches that we call yogas. So, how do we get to this position? Buddhya vishuddhaya yukto dhritya tvanam niyamyacha shabdadin vishayam stapta raga deveshu vyudasya cha. Now, I recall that we have been through this before but maybe very briefly. So, this 51st stanza is telling us, Buddhya vishuddhaya, with an intellect that is pure, endowed with this pure understanding or intellect, and restraining the self with firmness, turning away from sound and other objects and abandoning attraction and aversion. So this is what is necessary. let us have a look at this. There are many people who engage in scriptural study. Now we know that to be effective in your scriptural studies, including what we're doing here, this Bhagavad Gita, the approach has to be to listen, Shravana, to reflect on it, Manana, that is, to get a clear understanding. But the understanding is increased. It is understood more fully when it is known, and this is where Nididhyasana comes in, that is meditation. And this is simply the reverse of how these scriptures developed. Scriptures developed through meditation, and then in terms of language that we can understand, and then for the general populace. Before writing, it was told as we are telling it now in the ancient days. It's no good just listening or reading it. During the course of the week, I asked somebody, have you read a certain book? And they said, oh yes, read it. It reminded me actually of a cartoon series. Somebody gave me a book once called Top Secret, about Benedictine monks and the ideal, the typical way in which we think of these of monks is in a private cell there, suitable for private prayer and worship and meditation, and a small window. We get the idea of a prison cell from this idea of a monastic cell. So, and the two monks are sitting there on benches, and one offers one the scripture, let's say Bible, and the other one puts his hand up and says, no thanks, I read it. Yes, you can read it, but did you really imbibe its contents? Did you really understand it? That is why we have these series. We have these series so that from week to week, you may reflect. First, you may read along with me, then you may reflect, and then you may meditate on it and get to the real understanding of it. So, pure understanding is the term. This is what is called pure understanding, not superficial understanding, because superficial understanding will lead to much dialectics, much argumentation, much debate, much interpretation, much difference of opinion. We find in religions everywhere, this is the case. The scripture says this. No, that scripture says that. This contradicts this. I think it means this. I think it means that. And so you have to really find out what is the inspirational thing? What does it actually mean? What comes to you? What is the divine grace that flows to you in order for you to understand? And so endowed with pure understanding and restraining the self, that is, restraining the psychophysical self, the body and mind complex that we typically identify as this is me, this is I. Primarily physical, with a certain behavioral set of traits and habits attached to it. Collectively call it I. But we have to control this I from time to time, no, with firmness, with steadiness, with a sense of determination, sense of regularity. Don't forget, practice is not the important thing. It's steady practice, doing the same thing, cultivating a habit, rather cultivating a counter habit to all the habits that we have. And then turning away from all the objects of the senses, summarized as Shabda, sound, because I explained last week, or maybe the week before, that all of these variations and manifestations that we call our familiar world all come from this one thing called Akasha. And we can interpret this Akasha as productive of vibration. And when the ear catches it, we call it sound. But the whole universe, according to the ancient Sankhya system, would be a whole set of permutations, combinations of waves. And so just to make sure that there's no difficulty in understanding, and other objects also. So all the whole world, our familiar world, that has to be there. And so it starts from a principle. Without the principle, we have no motive to do the practice. And that principle and that practice is dealing with our everyday life. It's practical. Everybody is beset by problems and difficulties and obstacles. How to get over them? Well, first of all, understand some set principles and then go and do the practice. And so the Bhagavad Gita has set out these principles in very clear language so there can be no mistake, no interpretation different. And just to make sure we have it, it's repeated. And of course, you can approach it from 3 different philosophical points. But when you consolidate it all together, you'll find these are just progressions. These are just, supplementary positions, one on top of the other, which lead us, because don't forget, these are steps. And then abandoning our behavior, our normal behavior, so-called normal behavior. And the behavior is to do with attraction and aversion. We are drawn towards something, we're drawn away from something. Every desire has a counteractive fear, and we're pulling away from the things we don't like, the painful things, the fearful things, to the things that we like, the things that are pleasurable, the things that we are attached to. And the test of it is, when you lose those things, how do you feel? Supposing you invest in a big house and then the house burns. Maybe the insurance will cover it, but still, all your photographs went, all your accumulated possessions, all your treasures handed down from your parents, their parents, etc., all the precious furniture that you purchased, that you spent some time looking at, deciding on, selecting, all the painting and decorating you may have done, all the children's toys if you had children, everything in the household gone. How will you feel? Happy? Unhappy? But a proper evaluation of this will say, these are material things. These are just made from waves. If I am not attached to them, I won't be sorrowful when they go away from me. And don't forget, we are presenting an ideal to be as practical as possible, to work toward it. But we have to set out, this is the ideal, this is the goal, this is where we want to be. And so, you can say that the nature of pure understanding requires obviously to be looked into, but seen through a blue glass, a yellow object appears green because of the blue and yellow will produce that color, that effect. But the peculiarity of the instrument of seeing gets itself imposed on the object seen, and this is our difficulty. And this comes to our principle. What we see is not what we get. We have to thoroughly understand this. And so we have to engage in jnana. We have to engage in discernment, the practice of discrimination. But what else? Well, viviktasya lagvasi yata vaka yamanahasa jnana yoga paro nityam vairagyam samupashritaha. So this is to do with a cultivation of the mind. How we cultivate body and mind? We have to go counter. Tapasya means going against the grain, causing a little friction, going away from the normal thing, being prepared and happy to change. Most people don't like change. You feel uncomfortable, unfamiliar territory. But if you want to grow and develop, then you take on a risk. You are prepared to change, particularly if there's a good reason to change. And understanding these principles provides us with a good reason to change. It is not our nature to be in solitude. We are gregarious social beings at the human level. And what we're saying then is, why don't you go against the grain? Ideally. So now we bring in something that is nityam, something that is jnana yoga paro. That is engaged in meditation, engaged in concentration. Now we have just described jnana yoga, now we are describing dhyana yoga, meditation. It's not one thing or the other. This is an integrated system. So how do we meditate unless we dwell in solitude? How can we engage in activity and dwell in solitude? You can feel in solitude, walking down a busy street, in a busy city, in a city center, surrounded by noise, surrounded by traffic. You can feel a sense of solitude if you have a mind to. Seeing action, action in inaction, inaction in action. You remember that? The cultivation of being able to stand in a poised position, see what the Creator sees, sit on the royal throne of the Lord of the universe and beam from there, from a poised state, withdrawing everything to there. That's possible, regardless of your surrounding. In the contrary way, you can be sitting on a desert island and your mind will be hankering for other things. You will be missing the shopping mall, etc. You can sit on a desert island and think that it is the ideal place, like a travel brochure picture of contentment. But they never told you that on this desert island, there are sandflies and mosquitoes that will bite you. And you can swim out to a reef and cut your toes. And all these other things, you see. So we build up this unrealistic shadow picture and we don't understand how can we cultivate this stillness, dwelling in solitude, if possible. Eating but little, we eat far too much. I always tell people that the yogic way of thinking is that your two hands is the size of your stomach. And one half should be full of solid food. And the other half should be divided, again half, so that 1/4 of the whole should be air and the other water. And there are various reasons why people eat. First of all, they get in the habit. They think that they require more food than they actually do. And more food is available. The commerce has given us big things, family-sized things, doubling, tripling, quadrupling the size of food available today. And then we eat hollow food. So eating a little doesn't mean starving yourself. It means eating what is enough for the body's metabolism, that's all. Because all food can be sublimated as sacred food. All food can be prasad. That is why at meal times, we take from this Bhagavad Gita, that prayer, that Brahma, Panam, Brahma, Havi, and so on. Thinking that as we're eating, we are offering as we would offer in a sacred fire, doing a havan or a yajna. Eating itself is a yajna. Every activity can be a yajna. Attending to your family is a yajna. Don't tell me or don't ask, when will I have time for spiritual activities? Eating is a spiritual activity. Feeding your family is a spiritual activity. Going to work is a spiritual activity. And Arjun's fighting this war is his spiritual activity. What spiritual activity should we do? Whatever you find yourself in, that is your field of spiritual life. Don't think, when will spiritual life come? Spiritual life is here. If you're married, your spiritual life is being a husband or a wife, or a father or a mother. If you're a student, your spiritual life is being a student. A doctor being a doctor, a lawyer being a lawyer, an accountant being an accountant, and a Swami being a Swami. So all of these fit in. This is the importance of doing our duty. And then speech. So now we have eating little, then also body and mind subdued. So now we recall 17th chapter where what kind of tapas is required. And we can recall there is a physical, there is a speech, and there is a mental. These are the three varieties of tapas. And this is reiterated here. So body and mind subdued, that is controlled, like we control a chariot. It's not an accident that Lord Krishna is sitting there as charioteer in a chariot, and we're told, let the reins be. See, the reins are the intellect, or at least the reins are the connection, the mind, and so on. And the charioteer is the intellect, or the occupant is the intellect, and the horses are the senses, the indriyas. The chariot is the body, and all of this is all an analogy, beautiful analogy of how we should be regarding body and mind. So speech, we have to control speech. Don't worry about murdering somebody or not murdering somebody or wishing somebody harm, or words can be like toxic poison. Words can destroy. This was mentioned in the 17th chapter. So we are really talking about meditation and tapas. And the prerequisite for all meditation is self-control. Don't forget, in Patanjali Yoga Sutras, the whole textbook, if you will, the whole aphoristic literature on meditation and concentration. And when we talk about meditation of an eightfold path, meditation only comes number 7, way down, because, or up, depending on your picture, because all the other steps have to be followed first. How can we meditate when we have no calmness of mind in the beginning? So we have to have this self-control, mentioned in many places. Katha Upanishad is one of those. You have self-control first. Otherwise, how will you meditate? Bhagavad Gita we read also has this point of view. And so the 6th chapter of this Bhagavad Gita that is dedicated to the subject of meditation, this very chapter tells us that we should see the self in all beings in the self, that we should have this self-control, that we should do our duty, our karma yoga. Meditation begins with karma, action in your day-to-day life. Because when you sit down for meditation, 99.99% of the day will crowd in, and unless that was all dedicated Godwards, unless that was all purity of activity, full of concentration and dedication, steered Godwards, unless that was there, how can you sit down for meditation? All of the activities, all the stresses and strains and concerns and difficulties of your 99.999% of your day will all crowd in and demand their attention. So always engaged in meditation. Always. I thought we could meditate for 20 minutes a day, 30 minutes a day, an hour, sometimes 2 hours, twice a day, 3 times, whatever it is. No, always engaged. The mind should always be engaged in the midst of activities and concentration, endued with dispassion, vairagya. Now, this is a very misunderstood word. It doesn't mean to say that we are heartless. It does not mean to say that we have no passion. It simply means that we are attached to God. When we are attached to the truth or reality, what is less than truth, what is impermanent, what is a shadow of it, what is trivial, falls away by itself, just as your behavior as an adult. You didn't have to renounce childhood and childish ways. It fell off by itself. St. Paul tells us, when I was a child, he says, I used to, and he mentions a whole series of activities, but now I no longer do those things. I've grown out of that. So we have to outgrow these childish ways. And this is the idea of endued with dispassion, because we don't own this world. So just reviewing some of these things, both overeating and undereating, of course, are harmful. In Africa, in some regions, a large proportion or percentage of the populace is malnourished, children in particular, malnourished. But in Western countries, for example, where there's an abundance of food, there's also malnourishment. And the malnourishment comes from obesity. But a yogi will be balanced, because a yogi wants to be vigorous. A yogi wants to get energy and use it well, not be engaged in disease and illness and sickness, or weight issues, or stress issues. And the spiritual fervor of the spiritual practitioner contributes to the sustenance of the body and the vigor of the mind. So physical food, therefore, gets automatically reduced without any effort. Effortlessly it happens. Perfect command over speech, body, and mind, that is what is required if we are to acquire, as it were, or to discover this perfection that is inherently the drive from within. So a beginner will try to cultivate this quality of vairagya or dispassion to the world, because he can reflect on the evils of the contact of the senses with their objects, so that whenever a passing thought of indulgence comes into an unwary mind, and there'll be some kind of struggle, but after a while, with continuous practice, the struggle goes away completely, like a ripe fruit that falls off by itself. We don't have to force it. Ahamkaram balam darpam kamam krodam parigraham vimucha nirmamaha shanto brahma bhuyaya kalpate. The whole difficulty that we have is only one thing: egoism. Egoism means I mistakenly assume that I am a body-mind complex, a unit, independent of any other, that has to struggle against a world either by using aggression or using power or acquiring desire or some such thing. So, assuming that you have abandoned this sense of prophet-actor complex called egoism, violence comes as a result of it. Power, if you will, or balam, strength, then darpam, arrogance. All of this is desire to dominate. So there's a dominant aspect in a personality. When you deal with this ego aspect, all the rest are gone by themselves. But what is it? A sense to dominate your environment in various ways. And then a desire to get from the environment what you feel is lacking or missing. Again, it comes back to I. But it is all to do, we can understand this when we put the egoistic words in with it. So let's try that. So having abandoned egoism and the I am powerful, that we can join the egoistic script to all of these things. I dominate. I am arrogant. I desire. And this enmity which is there is all to do with the fact that I think I have to defend myself, or I have to deal with the world as an individual, as an agent, or as an owner, or as a profiteer. And so I assume my property, this is my property. If you have this idea, then you will always be bound and you will always be struggling. Endlessly so. You'll always be in a condition of unhappiness, discontent, pain. This is a practical message. If you want to be free from that, some different formula has to be used. So if you're free from this notion of mine, see, vimuccha nirmamaha. This is having abandoned the sense of mine, possession. Then what happens? Shantaha, Brahma, Bhuyaya. That person is peaceful and is fit for becoming Brahman. Now we think when we want to do any activity that we have to get a level of fitness, particularly physical activity. Supposing we want to run a marathon. There's a person I know here who engages in the marathon every opportunity. And they say how painful it is. And they still do it. And why do you do it? But afterwards I feel so good. I feel I've achieved something. All right, okay. But can you just enter it? Can you just, no. I have to train. I have to be fit. Same thing in spiritual life. We have to be fit. We have to engage in a program of fitness. And we just described what to do. What is your training schedule? So thinking that you're an individual, a physical entity, you'll try to have the upper hand against everybody else. That's the difficulty. You'll try to dominate. And this will make you very arrogant. Even if you say, I am wise, the arrogant attitude of it is, you're all a fool, you're all foolish. If you say, I wish to dominate, it means I wish to take advantage of your weakness. But that's your own weakness. And then this desire is the hankering after sense pleasure. If you cherish the senses, you are bogin, not yogin. So we have to curb the senses. And you find there's an unobstructed fondness transforms itself into something higher, something more valuable. And it can transfer it into something negative, enmity. So the yogi who sees divinity in all is given neither to a liking or a fondness, nor to the opposite, enmity. There is no enemies. See, bodily sustenance is not possible without property. Property is necessary. A house is necessary. And a body is necessary, and mind is necessary. All that is necessary. But the ownership of the body leads to the ownership also of the property too. That's the problem. As soon as you say or express the ownership of a body, physical ownership, you're also expressing ownership of all the things associated with it that sustains it. My food, my house, my career, my bank account, etc. And that trifling property is handled, I would say, with the same indifference and detachment shown to the body in the right sense. So a yogi is free from all of that, free from ownership. A beautiful example of a a crow that takes a piece of bread and it gets hassled, starts flying away, and it gets hassled by all the other crows and every bird, and eventually just drops it. So the secret is letting go. We have to learn to let go. Let go of the body, let go of the mind, let go of everything. Can we let go easily? Can we let go of grudges? Some people find it reasonably easy to forgive, but not to forget, which means they never forgave. Actually, only temporarily. They just tolerate something. But this forgetfulness, no. Holding on. The holding on aspect is one of the most difficult things in this spiritual cultivation. Holding on to this ownership of the body, holding on to old habits in the mind, in the unconscious mind, holding on to all the things that prop it up, the whole environment. I don't say let it go in actuality. That is, sell your house, sell your... No, I won't say that, because most people are not of that type. But let go of attachment. And the way to do it is not to do it in a negative way, but do it in a positive way. What do I mean by that? Give it to its proper owner. Lord, this is yours. This is your house. If somebody said, I don't want to get bogged down in these material things, but there's a property that has been given to me by a family member, and I'm wondering, should I take it up? I said, yes, but it's a kind of small house, like a cottage. Or call it the Divine Mother's cottage, or call it the, dedicated, in other words. It becomes your ashram. It becomes your sacred place. When you enter it, you'll take your shoes off. Moses faced with God as a burning bush, the divine. And the bush says, Moses, take off your shoes. The ground on which you stand is holy ground. All ground is holy if we have a mind to register it in the proper way. We have to re-register it. Having registered it originally as our own or as something separate, we have to re-register it. This is God's earth. This is God's planet. Now, if we do that, then we have no ecological crisis. We have no difficult environmental issues. But unfortunately, this understanding of ownership, coupled with arrogance, has made it difficulty for us in generations to come. So when all the disturbing factors are eliminated from the mind rests in peacefulness. Having taken away all the disturbances, this peacefulness, what we describe as the peace that passeth all understanding, that enters into our psyche. We become completely peaceful. And so the yogi imbued with these excellences is fit for becoming Brahman. That is his course of fitness. Brahma Putaha Prasanatma na shochati na kankshati samaha sarveshu bhuteshu mad bhaktim labate param. Becoming Brahman. It's a phrase. How can we become something we already are? It's a phrase. We don't feel a unity, we feel separated. When we no longer feel that separation, becoming Brahman, and what will your state of mind be? Completely serene. Serene-minded because you'll only see that one, and you'll see that everywhere. In neither griefs nor desires. The whole thing is about na shuddhati. Doing away with sorrow. That person does not grieve. We are all suffering from grief. Even small disappointments put us into a state of grieving. Neither grieving nor anything else. Let us go back to a statement I made a little earlier. In describing the Mahabharata war and so on, we gloss over the fact of how horrendous war is, how blood will flow, how suffering is there, how groaning is there. The horror of dispatching a body or cutting it into pieces. It's not a pretty sight. So it has to happen. But there's a person like this, the yogi will not see it like this, because all activities will have to be divine, even those things which to other people will be abhorrent. That is why this whole scenario is truly dramatic and therefore truly practical, showing us the extreme of extreme examples of what is a sacred duty. But becoming Brahman, there's no separation. Understanding the principle and following it up, endorsing it as a reality through practice, will make us serene-minded even in the most difficult of circumstances, neither grieving nor desiring. And because the same to all beings, he obtains supreme devotion to me. This is now transmuted into Bhakti Yoga. It is only people who don't understand who make these two things separate. There's a Jnana Yoga and there's a Karma Yoga. And we are saying, or there's a Jnana Yoga and there's a Bhakti Yoga, or there's a Karma Yoga and there's a Bhakti Yoga. Here is a true integration of all our specialities, all the aspects of humanity, that we have hands to do work, we have an intellect to think and evaluate, and we have a heart to feel. So becoming Brahman, that is one with Brahman, as the Jnani would want. Serene-minded and so on, he neither grieves nor desires, equal-minded everywhere, because he understands what is real, what is unreal, what is just a shadow, what is light. The same to all beings. He obtains supreme devotion to me, this love of God. See, there are those who see differences between this bhakti and jnana, but prompted by bias and predisposition, the one school of thought holds jnana as superior. I've heard that. I've heard people in this modern era, in Ireland and other places in the West, who proudly boast, see, I am an Advaitin. I have no truck with any of this singing and so on and so forth. That's an inferior way of doing things. They just don't understand. When you take a prime example was Sri Ramakrishna, who started off wanting to understand God as a mother, and having understood it thoroughly, understanding being the same as knowing, then gets this jnana, because sees this entity everywhere, in every being, through all hands and eyes and arms and so on. Will you not eat, say his disciples, when he's suffering from the cancer, sorely stressed that he's not eating anything or able to eat anything? Then wouldn't you ask the mother for the capacity to eat? Then he asks and the reply comes. Are you not eating through all these mouths? This universal entity with 1,000 arms, 1,000 eyes, 1,000 heads. See, so recently we celebrated, along with our Hindu brothers and sisters, we were doing the Durga Puja and the Navaratri, the 9 days like that. It's sacred to every Hindu. And a catch question I ask, how many arms on average does Mother Durga have? And you think of the image, sometimes portrayed as 8, sometimes 10, and so on and so forth. No, on average, it must be about 14 billion on average, because some humans don't have 2 arms necessarily, but every human, most humans will have. And so 7 billion people, 14 billion arms, every body is that entity. If you can look at it in that way, this is the way of looking at it, which is jnana. And it culminates in this bhakti. And there's a great example here. There's only an artificial between these two things. There's some preliminary distinctions, no doubt, and they may seem to exist between these two paths, jnana and bhakti. Whereas they become one and the same as they culminate together. The jnani will get bhakti and the bhakti will get jnana. That is our assurance. So where's the scope here for this jnana? So there's an incident that clarifies the point, and actually this incident was told to me when I first met Swami Nisrasananda in Africa. I was about 15, and he was about my age, not what I am now. And at the very first meeting, he told me a story. So there was a benefactor who liberally serviced and gave to the poor, gave gifts to the poor. And the poor used to go to him for their own welfare, knowing that he was generous. But one day, he was involuntarily drawn to a young boy of 15, coincidentally, who was found in the middle of all these holy nomads. And so the boy's physical feature, he had a scar on his cheek. And it roused the rich man's interest and his curiosity. And he said, because the nomads had responded to his inquiry, who is this boy? And they gave information that this boy, when he was about 12 years old, or 12 years before they actually picked him up, actually, that boy was lying unconscious in a riverbank somewhere in that locality in which they found him. And the benefactor concluded that this, in fact, is the child, his own child of 3, that he lost in a boat tragedy. Inquiring closely, where did you find him? What age was he when you found him? This boy had a scar on the cheek. It must be the same boy. And so the apparently lost son was reclaimed with great joy, of course, and filial love. So knowing and loving are interrelated. When you know, the story says, when you know that is that boy that was lost, then this loving comes more so than if it were an anonymous entity. This is a wonderful example. So one augments the other. Bhakti being involved in jnana and jnana being involved in bhakti, these are just natural things. And a Brahman jnani, a knower of Brahman, is simultaneously a bhakti to Ishvara, God. He beholds all beings with reverence, they being the veritable manifestations of this one God, and recognizing God everywhere in all beings. He doesn't grieve that there's any loss that might occur. No desire crops up in his mind for anything that he has not obtained. The bhakti eulogized way back in chapter 7. In chapter 7, stanza 17, we find this. You see, Tesham jnani nitya yukta yika bhaktiye vishishyate. Of these, the wise man, ever steadfast and devoted to the one, excels, for supremely dear am I to the wise, and he is dear to me. Immediately we find this merging, jnana and bhakti. So, this next stanza, what is the time? We're nearly to 9 o'clock. We just have a few more minutes to go. We're probably there already, so we'll finish off on this one. Bhaktyamam apijanati yavan yaschasmi tattata tato mam tattoto nyata vishyate tat anantaram. Bhaktya, by devotion, he knows me in truth, what and who I am. Krishna, the avatara of this Ishvara. Then having known me in truth, what does that mean? Brahman, he forthwith enters into me. That is another way of saying becomes Brahman. When that nearness of the ocean becomes oneness, then this bhakti yields into this. Sri Ramakrishna has this to say. It is possible for the Jivatman, that is the individual soul, to merge in the Paramatman, the Supreme. He can then state, I and my Lord are one. A devoted servant of a master may in the long run be treated by him as a member of his family. Being quite pleased with his earnest service, the master may also install the servant in his place and empower him to execute the domestic concerns in his stead. We are just stewards. We are stewards of the divine Lord's property. We call it body, we call it mind, and he allows us to say me, my, but it's his. And so, being quite pleased with his earnest servant, the master may also install the servant in his place and empower him to execute the domestic concerns in his stead. But the installed man declines that high office with compunction, and still the master insists on his assuming that status. Come on. It is in this way that Ishvara, the personal God, claims the ardent devotee as his own. He first reveals his attributes, the omnipresent, omniscient, and all of that, ever loving, beneficent, etc. And then his glories to the bhakta. And the bhakta develops love of God through contemplating all the glories. God's grace pouring through every avenue that is observed and every sound that is heard, every movement. And then it absorbs him in union, because that love gets richer and deeper and ultimately melds into that one. There's a glorious and beautiful merging of all of these human capacities that we have, that we allocate to a particular yoga. So these yogas are just different starting points, culminating in exactly the same thing. Sarva karmani api sada kurvano vajapa shrayaha. What prasadat avapnuti shashvatam padam avyayam. All actions, sarva karmani, all actions, be they domestic, be they at the workplace, so-called, be it before the shrine, all activities, be it thinking, be it eating, all activities, doing continually all actions whatsoever, taking refuge in me is the point. By my grace, he reaches the eternal Padam abode. Shashvatam, the eternal Padam abode, which is also avyayam, indestructible. Now we bring in karma, bhakti. Do all actions for his sake. Do all actions as if you were doing ritualistic worship. I came across somebody recently. They said, I'm so stressed. My job is putting me under huge pressure. I don't have time for anything. I barely have time every morning, say for 10 minutes puja. You see how they made a distinction. They think that the 10 minutes puja is completely different and separate from all their office activities or corporate activities. So we do all these activities in the same way. What is the difference between lighting a lamp at the altar and turning a light on, or switching your computer on, booting up your computer? What is the difference between offering a flower and offering somebody a cup of tea? What is the difference between prayer to God and speaking to your colleague or neighbor? Literally, the actions are the same, but the intent is different. We can make the intent the same also. So this is karma bhakti. I hope we can understand a little bit more, and more importantly, practice this dimension of spiritual life in day-to-day living. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Peace, peace, peace be unto all.